Hi, welcome for joining us. My name is Mary Kate Carey. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Virginia and the senior fellow at the Miller Center there. And I'm here to interview my friend Lisa Gable, who is my fellow graduate of the University of Virginia as well. Go Who's, and former delegate to the United Nations, former ambassador, presidentially appointed by 4 different administrations, and a mastermind of the turnaround, having worked for too many Fortune 500 companies to keep track of. So she is the author of a new book, Turnaround. And Lisa, first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us today to talk about your new book.
Well, it's great to see you as always, and thanks for having me on.
So Lisa, let's start with what is it in your experience, as you say in the book, a core competency. What is yours, as opposed to that of some of the companies you've helped, that cause all of these organizations to call you when they are in trouble? What is it that you bring to the table that really I don't think anybody else does?
Well, I was very fortunate to start my business career at Intel Corporation, working for Craig Barrett, who became the CEO and chairman of the board of Intel. And what I learned is how to apply manufacturing disciplines to solving complex problems. And then I was able to weave in the art of diplomacy that I learned at the White House and the State Department in order to ensure that when we're making changes and we're dealing with complex issues, that we always remember the human factor.
I was thinking as I was reading the book this weekend, and first of all, let me just say, so well written. I'm a writer, so I appreciate a well written book, and you bring in so many fascinating stories, which I want to get to in a second. But sort of in the background of all this, I was thinking as I was reading about, I was thinking about COVID and how just like the COVID, the disease affects people in so many different ways. You have everybody from asymptomatic to slightly sick to people on ventilators to people who've lost their lives. You see the same thing in our economy, where people, some businesses flourished and everybody could do it remotely and it was really not a big deal. Other businesses, say grocery stores or urgent care centers, where the employees were just strapped 24/7, very, very stressful situations. And then some businesses, so many retail establishments just didn't make it at all. And so you saw the different stresses on individuals medically and on businesses financially. And I thought, was that one of the things that drove you to write this book? I assume you wrote during COVID, but was it because of so many businesses heading south that you thought this was the right time, or was this something you were going to do anyway?
Well, what's interesting is I was actually down the path of writing a book on leadership and mentorship, and which is going to be my second book. However, I got a call from a publisher, and in that conversation, he said, Lisa, by the time we come out of this, when your book's ready, people are going to need to understand really the basic tenets of how to turn around an organization. And so could you please, and he said, you've done turnarounds in philanthropy, in government, and in business. Could you sort of document how you did that and provide people with a level of hope as well as different methods that they can use in order to turn things around, in order to assess what's going on in their organization? So I actually started writing the book in Labor Day of last year, wrote it every weekend. I work full time as a CEO, and so I was getting up at 7 a.m., going out to the screened-in porch of my guest house and writing until 4 o'clock and working with a wonderful editor on really getting that book done in 6 months. And so we're very excited about it coming out, and just hoping that, again, we can give people hope, that we can help them think about the human factor of what people are going through, and most importantly, solving the underlying problems within their organization that might be causing them the stress points that you outlined.
I don't want to give away. So there's 4 steps that you have in the book. I don't want to give them away because we want people to buy the book and read it. We'll leave them in suspense. But the 4 steps are all illustrated with absolutely fascinating stories of the organizations that you have worked with and how you learned those steps through them. And I am not a business person. Obviously, I'm a teacher and a mom and things like that. But I thought it was very readable, very understandable, and yet had a lot of things that I wasn't expecting. And it was not a boilerplate sort of business book. I think I should highly recommend it to people of all ages and all walks of life, because whether you're a Fortune 500 CEO or you're the head of the PTA, I could think of one exception. I don't think anybody in a book club who's the head of a book club might not need this, but but other than that, just about every organization I could think of, charities raising money, community organizations, so much good advice. So let me start with one thing that I'll read you a quote from the book. One of your first pieces of advice, step number one, is sort of visualize the future. What do you want? What's your dream scenario? So the quote is, to visualize a new future scenario, it often helps to focus on your customers or your constituents' pain points instead of your own, obviously. So often, in an effort to build something great, we fail to truly appreciate what they want and need, and therefore what will lead to our success. And this struck me because in my speech writing classes that I teach in the university, we say that most CEOs, before they stand up and give a speech, say to themselves, well, what do I want to say in this speech? And really, the question they should be asking is, what does this audience need to hear? Which is a very different question. And so I was hoping you could expound on that, because that really resonated with me, because it reminds me of what I say to my students. Think about what the other guys need, and how are we going to meet that? Do you have some examples of that?
I do. So one of the things I talk about is you need to acknowledge their pain points. You actually need to verbally acknowledge where they're at. What people may not understand is what circumstances are causing their pain points, but you need to acknowledge that they exist. The other thing that you need to do is when you show up and you start to make significant change, you need to speak with facts. And that was something I learned from my mentor, Craig Barrett, the former CEO and chairman of Intel Corporation, which is use data, use facts to very precisely lay out what the problem is, what's causing the pain that people are experiencing, and then what needs to be changed in order to have that pain point alleviated. And I think that's the hardest thing during COVID right now, is that we're all pivoting so much. I know for my own organization, I sure as heck would love to stop the churn. And it seems as if the one analogy I've been using recently is with the Delta variant, I feel like I have one foot in the pool and one foot on the concrete. And I'm sitting there going, are we diving into the pool? Are we staying out of the pool? Are we going back to the office? What are we doing? And so you have to constantly ground people in, here's the underlying cause of what's going on. Here's the data that indicates that if we don't do these 3 steps, we're actually going to potentially backslide into a situation that's not economically sustainable. Here are the changes that we've made in the organization. Here are the quantitative values associated with those changes. So what I might say is, beyond the acknowledgement, is keep the emotion out and just make sure that you are speaking with data that resonates and makes sense to people, so they can start organizing their thoughts in their minds and understanding where it is that you're trying to take them.
So when you talk about where you're trying to take people, and not necessarily working with what's in front of you, but what you want it to be eventually, you had a fascinating story about an organization that I had not heard of, but I think it would be great interest to our viewers here, is the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation. And can you tell us about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
So the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation was an organization I ran for 7 years and actually helped found. And where it came from is that we were experiencing an obesity crisis. And that was in the early 2009, 2008 time period. And the food and beverage companies had been making a number of changes in their product portfolio, but there was no mechanism in place to count the changes that they were making and also the benefits of those changes in a manner that regulators and public health officials and key influencers would accept. And so the companies, 16 food and beverage companies led by Indra Nooyi, who had been the CEO of PepsiCo, came together and said, we've got to do something. We're making all these changes. We've been making changes pretty much since the late 90s. Nobody understands what these changes are, how they're benefiting people. We need to kind of count it. And they looked at multiple different factors. We're talking about 16 companies that made lots of different products. They made frozen foods, breads, candy, yogurt, milk. They made a wide variety of products, beverages, snacks. And so we were trying to find a common denominator that we could all make a commitment on. And so, six of the companies would go, well, if we made this change in fats in our products, then that would help solve the problem. And the candy company sitting there going, well, I can't do that because there's this international standard that's managed out of Belgium, and we're not allowed to make changes to our food. And then the cereal companies,
Like chocolate has to have a certain percentage, right?
it does. Chocolate has, and it's a global standard. And then the cereal companies would raise their hands and like, wait a second, there's this USDA rule that says we can't change this thing in our food. And so we're struggling with it. We had meeting after meeting. And one of the things I talk about in the book is I had migraines, and I'm like popping migraine medicine. And we're on this crummy little regional train going up to New Jersey, where I'm pulling together public health officials that are affiliated with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and 16 food and beverage company scientists and marketers together, and they just could not come up with anything. And so finally, the CEO of McCormick, which is the spice company, said, we have this process with our Idea Lab, and we bring everybody together, and the people who work for us used to work at places like McKinsey. And so we're going to take everybody through a process and just see if we can come up with a common denominator, a place where we can all make a commitment and agree that making this one change is going to solve the problem. So for 2 days, we're in this room in Baltimore, and all of a sudden, the chief scientist from Campbell Soup, Chor Sang-koo, is sitting next to Claire Wong, who's a world-famous epidemiologist. They're over there in the corner. Everybody else is struggling. We've got pieces of paper up all over the place. And they leap up and they go, it's all about calories. Every food, the common denominator amongst every single food is calories. And if you reduce calories, you reduce sugars and fats. And you can do that in every single food that we produce. And that's what we did. We made an initial commitment to Michelle Obama to help launch the Let's Move campaign that we would reduce 1.5 trillion calories from the marketplace, and ultimately
1.5 trillion calories.
And we reduced 6.4 trillion calories, ultimately 3 years before we thought we would be done with the project. And one thing I tell people is what happened is all the companies were competing on one thing. They were all competing on calories. And so when you take 30, they sold 35% of the food sold in America was made by these companies. You get 16 fierce competitors competing on one thing. It wasn't surprising to me that we actually beat our goal by 400% because they're all working really, really, really hard to beat the next guy. Pepsi wanted to beat Coke, and General Mills wanted to beat Kellogg, and Campbell's wanted to beat Progresso. So when you have competition and the market really drives change, you can actually bring about significant differences for the consumers. And we were so lucky that Bill Dietz, who is formerly deputy of the CDC, affiliated with the National Academy of Medicine, did a report and showed how reductions of certain foods actually drove reductions in people's weight across different socioeconomic groupings. So that was the most interesting one I think I've ever done.
I thought that was fascinating, and it makes sense because we now see Progresso soups that are light soups, and Campbell's has light soups too now, and smaller serving sizes, and all those sort of things, and it's a direct result of that organization, and it was all sort of behind the scenes to most consumers, I think, but we're all benefiting from it. So I thought that was a fascinating story. Another story you were talking about of going back and seeing what's not working in the past was your first day on the job at what used to be called the World's Fair. It's now the World Expo. And pretty early on at the State Department, someone came in with a box and put it on your desk and said, you need to read through this box. And it was not a pleasant experience when you read through the box, but it gave you some insight and a roadmap. So why don't you explain a little bit of that story? Because I thought that was everybody can picture themselves having that happen to them of surprise at the office one day.
Well, I accepted the job because I had been asked by the White House to take over as U.S. ambassador to the World's Fair, which is basically today it's called the World Expo. But it started with the Eiffel Tower. So if anybody wonders where the Eiffel Tower came from, started, and actually hamburgers and ice cream were first introduced at a World's Fair because it was
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah. It was a mechanism for people to get together to start trade and to present innovative products. But the bottom line in the United States and actually globally, economically, the model of the World's Fair, for a variety of different factors, has never worked well. And so there's actually a book called Devil in the White City, which is about a serial killer at the Chicago World's Fair. So you get to read about the serial killer, but the other thing, if you're in the shoes I was in, I'm reading through the book and it's talking about all the problems they were having financially in both identifying support, paying for the fair, the cost overruns of the fair. So by the time I came on board, one of my predecessors had been indicted, had the FBI investigate him for misuse of government funds. He'd actually been hiring his family, set up an offshore bank account. It's covered in the LA Times. All this stuff had happened. Congress got so mad because historically World's Fairs had had such significant overruns and they didn't see the value of the U.S. participation any longer that in 1998 they passed a law and said no U.S. government money could be spent for a World's Fair. Well, that information had actually not completely been given to me when I accepted the job. So I walk into the job, and on my first flight to Tokyo to sign an agreement with the Japanese government, I get this phone call literally as I'm boarding the plane and go, well, we've been doing some research and we can't pay for your flight and we can't pay for your time in Tokyo to do your official function. And so my husband and I personally paid for me as a U.S. ambassador to fly to a foreign country for 2 weeks in the most expensive city in the world and sign a document. And we came back and someone did walk into my office and said, somebody did not tell you about all the historical problems. So they gave me this box of what are called Inspector General reports. And these are reports that are done by the government to understand what went wrong in something, what basically caused maybe a cost overrun or a malfeasance or something that happened. And I took those reports out. And this is something I talk a lot about in the book. Initially, when you read the report, it's not very clear. You're not quite sure why they got into trouble. And so I tried to line up what characteristics of every single fair had taken place. And then within the context of those characteristics, was there an underlying cause why these things had never worked well, why they were never financially viable, why they always ended up causing issues, even with really good people tripping over perhaps some government regulation they didn't know about that caused a problem. And so one of the key factors in any turnaround situation is you have to understand the underlying cause of the problem. And most people don't take the time to really whittle it down again, whittle it down. They spend a lot of time tweaking things. Surface issues are very apparent. People are mad at each other, something's not working, or it's costing too much. But the question you have to ask yourself is why? Why does this keep happening to us? Why does no one ever get to make that thing work? And so if you read the book, you'll get to find out how you do that and how you can discover what the underlying cause is of all the problems that you're facing within your organization.
I love that. Yeah, leave them in suspense. There was one scene in there was another chapter about sort of mapping your way forward and all of the great hands-on advice you have for people at any age in any organization. And it brought back, there was a story you told, but it reminded me when I was at a charity fundraiser in Washington at a famous art gallery that was raising money. And the director of development was next to me at dinner. And I said, this is a lovely gala. How much money does it bring in over the, each year? And he sort of like, what's wrong with you, lady? We don't bring money in from this. This actually costs us money. And I said, this is a charity fundraiser that doesn't raise money. And he was like, yeah, it's kind of a lost leader for us. And I remember turning around later to my husband and telling him, and he said, well, that'll be the last time we're attending this, because clearly it's not a well-run organization. And you were talking about getting to, when you first arrived at FAIR, the Food Allergy Research and Education Organization, that the walkathons were costing more than they were bringing in. And I've certainly seen that in some of the other walkathons I've been involved with, that you feel good, you think it's a great thing to be doing, people love it, but it may or may not be in the best interest of the organization to be running those. And it sounds like you came to have to make some hard decisions at FAIR, and it's turned out very well. But can you talk a little bit about that sort of decision of how do you get rid of the stuff that people love and are very sentimental about, but may or may not be best for the bottom line?
And one thing you have to remember is there are certain things like walks that were economically viable at one point in time. But because they've gotten so large or because the cost structure has changed, it makes it, we call about the economics of the business. Economics of the business means that there's certain factors, whether it's the pay that you have to pay people, it's the cost of shipping, it's the cost of the products that you need to include, wide variety of factors. And so walks were that thing. They were something that had been just really instrumental in bringing the community together, amazing families showing their dedication. And that is one incredible benefit of the walks, is that they were served as a mechanism for families to take action, get others involved, educate the community. But the reality is, by the time I walked in the door, because of a lot of economic factors, it was costing $2 million and only bringing in $1 million. The other thing is the amount of time people had to spend managing the complexity of a walk, getting stuff to different people, getting the t-shirts to people, getting the water bottles, whatever it was, making sure that the money came in. There are costs to that. And so when we needed to refocus people's time on factors that may have had what we call bigger margins. They might have had a way that you could execute on something with a larger amount of money that was being brought in. At that point, we had a discussion with those wonderful, wonderful volunteers and talked to them about the financial picture that existed with the walks and the fact that we couldn't continue to do it. And I have to say, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But by being really upfront with all of the different organizers, and we were very transparent. We showed them the financials and we said, this is what it's costing. This is how it's breaking down. I can't afford to keep doing this, because we know the number one goal all of us have is to find a therapy and a diagnostic that helps solve the problem of the disease. And so we need your help in helping us move this into a different economic category for how we keep you engaged, taking that money and instead investing it directly in the research. And people were very understanding, but it was tough. It was tough because it was one of their favorite things to do throughout the year. And we so appreciate everything those families did to elevate food allergies in their community.
And don't you think, too, that part of that pivot that you had to engineer, for example, I know I did this with a similar organization, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. I used to bring bags I'll call it a bag of hope, to newly diagnosed families. And it was a little cumbersome. There was, stuffed animals in there and all kinds of stuff. You couldn't just stick it in your purse and bring it over. And they, I think, have pivoted, as you guys have too, for a much better user experience for newly diagnosed families. And so if you could talk about that a little bit with FAIR and how you bring so much more hope to them through the funding of the research. And to me, that's where the joy and the hope comes from, is the research and learning about that.
Well, it's the research and making sure that we're actually driving innovation, like biomarker research, different research that we're doing on prevention to ensure that we might be able to actually help prevent children from developing the disease, which would completely change the dynamic. It would be absolutely incredible. And so, and we're doing some basic research between what we call the gut-brain axis, and we're doing it with an organization called FOSSI that recently spun off from the Broad Institute. And that's a huge research project. And so the research is allowing us to help guide industry in their investment portfolio. And also we work very closely with the NIH, which is investing, actually has placed food allergies as one of its top areas to focus on during the next 10 years. And so we're aligning our business plans with their business plans, because the bottom line is it's the alignment of all these dollars working towards the same primary objectives in research that's going to help companies then create innovations that will move to the consumer, move to the patient much more quickly. And so it's an exciting period of time, but you also have to keep people engaged. And through digital media, through things like our global summit, where we bring in all the families, we had 1,000 kids and their parents come. We have the teen program. Our teen program is amazing. And I have to say, these teens during COVID, they've started huge nationally organized food bank donations. They have done programs with colleges and universities. I mean, we've really unleashed the teens to utilize the technology to help solve the problem, because that's what you need. You need that energy of the next generation. And I write a lot of college letters of recommendation for our teenagers. I'm so proud of them.
I love that. That makes my day to hear that. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm at a university, but I just think that is that gives me great hope. And So then the last part of the book that really rang true to me as a mother and as a professor is when you talk about executing all these things and all the different pieces that you were just talking about, aligning everything together. You very eloquently talk about something that I associate with you, which is, humility, grace, compassion, and the human side of all this. You talk a lot about data and things like that, but can you talk a little bit about the way people should behave as they're trying to enact change and disrupt markets and transform organizations?
What you have to remember is that every time you make a decision, it impacts a human being. It just does. There's no way to avoid that. So if you're downsizing an organization, or perhaps you're spinning something off that you used to do and used to be a primary function of your organization, that will impact a human being. And I think by acknowledging the fact that it does, you can't stop the hard decision. And that's one of the mistakes a lot of people make, is it's really hard to make those decisions, and you have to make them, but you have to do it in a manner that demonstrates respect for the individual. And so I tell one story about an individual that was part of a downsizing that I was involved with, and his grace and humility during that process, and his just general recognition of what we were going through made me want to stay in contact with this individual. And so I ended up helping him get a job with one of our contractors. He worked at the organization. He worked at the contractor for a period of time. And where we came back a year, maybe a year and a half later, where we economically were viable for growth and we were able to start hiring people back on, he was one of the first people I hired. And so knowing that you may want to hire this person again, you may run into this person again. You may actually, it's Washington, D.C., you may end up working for that person. It's a moment in time. And a phrase that my friend Hank Cardillo always says is, it's just business. And for some people that sounds harsh, but I think both on the receiving end and the giving end, I'm in my late 50s now. I know what has had to happen at different points in times. It's not personal, but the manner in which you treat someone, that is personal. And so you always need to make sure that you show them the dignity and respect they deserve, because the economics, the business structure, for some reason, it isn't working and it's not the right fit for them at that moment in time.
It was great advice. That chapter alone, I think, is why I'm going to hand this book out to any number of 20-somethings, because it not only helps you realize how you should behave as you start your career and some of the principles that you should live by, but it also helps if you are on the receiving end of a layoff or something as a young person, how to react with grace. Because like you're saying, you never know. People circle back in your life. It's happened to me so many times. And I just thought that was a perfect way to end the book. And I think, like I said, that chapter alone makes this a book worth reading for every person of all ages, because young people especially, I think, need to hear that. And so thank you for that great advice. As a mom, it comes from a third-party validator instead of from me. And I appreciate that.
It's hard. We're going to be going through a lot of tough times, and we're keep going through tough times. I know all of us who are running organizations, you just wonder, is it ever going to end? And you're making decisions based on the plan that you wrote, based on the decisions that I help you lay out and the processes that you take. But it's not going to be easy for anybody. I mean, it really isn't. So the degree to which you can mentor people, stay in contact with them, and also, as you say, if you're on the receiving end, stay open to the mentorship, because it actually could result in really wonderful things for you someday. And I know I'm now at that age where I can see people who've circled back and worked for people again, where perhaps they were part of a layoff, but the way in which they handled it, as you said, allowed that person to maintain the relationship, help guide them and bridge them to the next opportunity. And then eventually, 10 years later, they're back together again.
Yeah, I think that's a very hopeful message. It's a very hopeful book about transforming organizations and getting them back on their feet again, which is exactly what we need right now at this moment in time and in the life of our nation. So thank you for writing this book, and good luck with the book tour and all the great people you're going to talk to. And thank you for joining us here today. It's been a joy talking to you, and congratulations on the book.
Well, thanks for having me. Anybody can pre-order the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. All the sites have it right now. Just do Lisa Gable and Turnaround, you'll find it. Or you can go to turnaroundbook.com, and that's where you can actually find the links directly to the book as well as make bulk sales. So buy the book.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today.